In introducing the term surplus repression, we have focused the discussion on the institutions and relations that constitute the social body of the reality principle. These do not just represent the changing external manifestations of one and the same reality principle, but actually change the reality principle itself. Consequently, in our attempt to elucidate the scope and the limits of the prevalent repressiveness in contemporary civilization, we shall have to describe it in terms of the specific reality principle that has governed the origins and the growth of this civilization. We designate it as performance principle in order to emphasize that under its rule, society is stratified according to the competitive economic performances of its members. It is clearly not the only historical reality principle. Other modes of societal organization not merely prevailed in primitive cultures, but also survived into the modern period. The performance principle, which is that of an acquisitive and antagonistic society in the process of constant expansion, presupposes a long development during which domination has been increasingly rationalized. Control over social labor now reproduces society on an enlarged scale and under improving conditions. For a long way, the interests of domination and the interests of the whole coincide. The profitable utilization of the productive apparatus fulfills the needs and faculties of the individuals. For the vast majority of the population, the scope and mode of satisfaction are determined by their own labor, but their labor is work for an apparatus which they do not control, which operates as an independent power to which individuals must submit if they want to live. And it becomes the more alien, the more specialized the division of labor becomes. Men do not live their own lives, but perform pre-established functions. While they work, they do not fulfill their own needs and faculties, but work in alienation. Work has now become general, and so have the restrictions placed upon the libido. Labor time, which is the largest part of the individual's lifetime, is painful time. For alienated labor is absence of gratification, negation of the pleasure principle. Libido is diverted for socially useful performances in which the individual works for himself only insofar as he works for the apparatus, engaged in activities that mostly do not coincide with his own faculties and desires. However, and this point is decisive, the instinctual energy thus withdrawn does not accrue to the unsublimated aggressive instincts because its social utilization in labor sustains and even enriches the life of the individual. The restrictions imposed upon the libido appeared as the more rational, the more universal they become, the more they permeate the whole of society. They operate on the individual as external objective laws and as an internalized force. The societal authority is absorbed into the conscience and into the unconscious of the individual and works as his own desire, morality, and fulfillment. In the normal development, the individual lives his repression freely as his own life. He desires what he is supposed to desire. His gratifications are profitable to him and to others. He is reasonably and often even exuberantly happy. This happiness, which takes place part-time during the few hours of leisure between the working days and working nights, but sometimes also during work, enables him to continue his performance, which in turn perpetuates his labor and that of the others. His erotic performance is brought in line with his societal performance. Repression disappears in the grand objective order of things which rewards more or less adequately the complying individuals, and in doing so, reproduces more or less adequately society as a whole. The conflict between sexuality and civilization unfolds with this development of domination. Under the rule of the performance principle, body and mind are made into instruments of alienated labor. They can function as such instruments only if they renounce the freedom of the libidinal subject-object, which the human organism primarily is and desires. The distribution of time plays a fundamental role in this transformation. Man exists only part-time, during the working days, as an instrument of alienated performance. The rest of the time he is free for himself. If the average working day, including preparation and travel to and from work, amounts to 10 hours, and if the biological needs for sleep and nourishment require another 10 hours, the free time would be 4 out of each 24 hours throughout the greater part of the individual's life. This free time would be potentially available for pleasure, but the pleasure principle which governs the id is timeless, also in the sense that it militates against the temporal dismemberment of pleasure, against its distribution in small, separated doses. A society governed by the performance principle must of necessity impose such distribution because the organism must be trained for its alienation at its very roots, the pleasure ego. It must learn to forget the distribution because the organism must be trained for its alienation. It must learn to forget the claim for timeless and useless gratification, for the eternity of pleasure. Moreover, from the working day, alienation and regimentation spread into the free time. Such coordination does not have to be, and normally is not, enforced from without by the agencies of society. The basic controls of leisure is achieved by the length of the working day itself, by the tiresome and mechanical routine of alienated labor. These require that leisure be a passive relaxation and a recreation of energy for work. Not until the late stage of industrial civilization, when the growth of productivity threatens to overflow the limits set by repressive domination, has the technique of mass manipulation developed in entertainment industry which directly controls leisure time, or has the state directly taken over the enforcement of such controls. The individual is not to be left alone, for left to itself and supported by a free intelligence aware of the potentialities of liberation from the reality of repression, the libidinal energy generated by the id would thrust against its ever more extraneous limitations and strive to engulf an ever larger field of existential relations. thereby exploding the reality ego and its repressive performances. The organization of sexuality reflects the basic features of the performance principle and its organization of society. Freud emphasizes the aspect of centralization. It is especially operative in the unification of the various objects of the partial instincts into one libidinal object of the opposite sex, and in the establishment of genital supremacy. In both cases, the unifying process is repressive. That is to say, the partial instincts do not develop freely into a higher stage of gratification, which preserves their objectives, but are cut off and reduced to subservient functions. This process achieves the socially necessary desexualization of the body. The libido becomes concentrated in one part of the body, leaving most of the rest free for use as the instrument of labor. The temporal reduction of the libido is thus supplemented by its spatial reduction.